What if I told you there's a secret that the airbrush industry never shared with us? This airbrush costs 15 euros, and this airbrush costs a little bit more than 350. Both tools do the exact same thing. So why the f is this one that much more expensive? Well, today I'm going to do some digging, travel across Europe, crash visit one of the world's biggest airbrush factories to learn what is a fuel air bomb, what secret does this machine hide, and grill the big boss on what really is the difference between a cheap airbrush and the more expensive ones. It's been nearly 150 years since the first airbrush was designed. And with 100 years, Harder & STEENBECK is the second oldest airbrush manufacturer still producing airbrushes today. And this is their factory.
Jump for the shit all top when I speak, all cap with the speech till they caught up in the rapture. I'm so out of line with the phrase game. Let's take a break, been a long day. Hit your line, what you fall through with the light sticks. Maybe help me spark the ideas. We got nowhere else to go. It's only up from there. I've been on my...
Throughout the last 150 years, airbrush designs have stayed largely the same. You have air coming in at the bottom, you have paint coming in at the top here in the cup, and they both meet here in the front to atomize the paint, giving a really nice smooth flow. And artists all over the world are currently using airbrushes for all kinds of different art. So let's start today's journey by figuring out how is an airbrush made. I am really excited because this is where it all starts, with rows upon rows of brass, we have aluminum and other secret alloys. I'm kind of excited to go see how they can sculpt the brass rods into something beautiful like this one. And let's start with one of the simpler parts of the airbrush, the cup. The cups are made using a process called turning, where the raw materials are spun at extremely high speeds. And in the case of Harder & STEENBECK, various diamond-tipped cutting tools are introduced to the brass rods in order to remove materials and create the shapes which you see in the final parts. It takes the machine about 90 seconds to make one of these cups from start to finish. And then we have a finished cup just like this one here. And sure, that was cool, but there's one more part that is made using the same process in an even smaller scale. And that, my friends, it's the nozzle. This is one of those parts of the airbrush that might sound simple to make, but it requires the utmost amount of precision, to the degree which the size is controlled to within 1/1000th of a millimeter. It is so delicate and difficult to produce that any form of change to the temperature within the machine, or just pausing the machine and opening it up, can be so devastating to the quality of this part that it would require hours and hours of recalibrating to get the machine up to the right temperature again and have it produce parts to the same level. And because of how sensitive this part is, once it is done, it rests for 2 hours in their technical office. That is always at 20 degrees Celsius. Once the 2 hours have passed, it is once again measured and controlled inside of this machine. Let's move on to the main part of the airbrush, the body. It actually consists of 4 different parts, so let's start with the body blank. The manufacturing process for it is much more complex than the cup. It starts with these massive metal rods that are fed into this Swiss lathe machine. And not only is turning used, but also milling, which differs from turning in that the raw material is stationary and the machine introduces spinning tools to cut complex features into the body blank. To get one of these finished body blanks, Harder & STEENBECK has over 50 machining operations just for the body blank. And once the body blank is done, it comes out looking like this. But it is not quite ready for the next step yet because it is all oily and got metal residue in there. So we gotta clean it. I know, I hate cleaning, it's so boring, but hear me out here. It's done with something called air bombing. They use alcohol to create the bomb in a vacuum. That's epic as f. all the body parts are put into this tiny prison and pushed into this massive machine. The machine then removes all of the air inside of the chamber, creating a vacuum. This is where high pressurized alcohol is smacked into the machine, creating a fuel air bomb. This cleaning removes all oil residue, and most importantly, any microscopic chips and metal bits remaining inside the airbrush. We have a few more really interesting processes that are unique to the way that Harder and STEENBECK makes their airbrushes. The one that's been most recently updated, actually as recent as this week, is this part, the trigger. It might seem insignificant and no different from what any of the other manufacturers do. And to actually understand what that is, I think we have to ask someone who actually knows this shit. This is Warwick, General Manager and Head of Product Development.
When we look at the history of the airbrush, what's the feature that's for a beginner other than the price? Now, we know the price has got to be right for a beginner, but let's put some features in there that actually really help them start their journey. Now, probably the most unfamiliar thing on the airbrush to a beginner is the trigger. So the two things that we've done is our trigger on the Ultra, you can't pull it back until you push it down. It teaches you how to do that through the engineering. And the second point is to learn how to control the trigger, there's two elements. It's how far do you pull it back and how far away are you? So we have this beautiful little click, click, click collar behind the trigger, which gives you three settings. One is so you can get really fine detail. That's when you're almost touching the subject. The second setting gives you very fine shading. You're about 2 fingers away from the subject, like a shoulder pad or something. And the third setting, which gives you like kind of a zenithal highlight kind of setting where you're about a hand's width away from the subject. So we kind of trying to make it so that when a beginner picks up an airbrush, they use it the right way first time and they get some really great results within the first 30 minutes. That's the goal.
But that doesn't really help experienced painters now, does it?
For an expert's airbrush, we know that they need a really responsive front part of the trigger, and our X-Center enables us to control that really precisely for an expert painter as well.
After having used airbrushes in every price range, from $15 to $80 to $150 to $450, it is details like this that makes me feel like it's really worth spending a little bit extra to get a better airbrush. Because as a beginner, you want your tool to help you become a better painter, not work against you. You don't want the airbrush to clog up due to poor engineering because you can't really clean the airbrush because all of its entry points are too small or you can't reach the needle or the nozzle. When you have an airbrush like that, you're going to end up never using it, because then it becomes more of a chore to paint than adding to your experience. But now let's move on to making more parts of the airbrush. The 3 most important parts of the airbrush is the needle, the air cap and the nozzle, and how these 3 work together. And out of all the 12 machines in this factory, 2 of them are dedicated to making the nozzle and the air cap. And there's just no other way to do it, because the synergy between these 3 have to be absolutely perfect. And with that, all of our parts are manufactured, but not quite ready for assembly and use. The next step is to polish them, or as Warwick calls it,
Kerama finishing.
These are large vats filled with precisely sized and shaped ceramic stones.
1 million tiny Thors and their Mjolnirs.
Which basically perfects the finish by microscopically beating the living shit out of each surface perfectly flat, and therefore to an extremely high gloss. After polishing, there's a massive inspection of each single part. If there's any microscopic error to any single one of these parts, they are taken out to the parking lot, they bring out the hand grenades, torchlights, hammers, and beat the living shit out of each part.
Stop! You know, we're just gonna recycle it with the other scrap, okay?
Oh, gosh, okay. The last step of the manufacturing process is to give the airbrush their plating, its final protective coat or finish. And that may differ a little bit depending on which airbrush it is and what finish it is supposed to have. Once manufacturing is done, it is time for assembly and spray testing. Every single airbrush has been tested by professional tester and made sure that it lives up to the quality that Harder and STEENBECK promises. That's also one of the reasons why we've always loved our Harder and STEENBECK airbrushes. But now, on to that question that we've all been waiting for. Warwick, what's actually the difference between, say, a beginner airbrush for $100 and the high-end airbrushes for $350?
Any airbrush that's been made by a serious airbrush manufacturer is a precision tool. What we've tried to do with our range is, rather than focusing on the application that the airbrush is going to be used for, we've focused on the user that's going to use it. The requirements of a beginner, they need support in learning the correct way to use the trigger. They need support in figuring out how far back to pull it, what distance to be away from the piece. Does it strip easy? Is it very difficult to damage? These are great features for a beginner. So the Ultra's loaded full of them. When you look at something like the Evo, it's all about speed. So you're at the point where you know how to paint, you've got a giant army that you want to get through. The Evolution is going to help you get through that faster than anything else to a really good standard. And then the Infinity. So now you're pursuing really fine detail. You're looking to get to that next level of creativity on your miniature where you're kind of blowing your own mind as you're painting it. And we get there with more extreme materials, more extreme machining processes that yield higher and higher levels of performance at the really top end. And we need more exotic materials to achieve that, particularly in the front end. When you use those materials, you need more extreme tooling, which needs more monitoring by more skilled staff. And that's kind of where the costs start to come in. Could you use the Ultra for everything? Of course you can. Absolutely. So it's really all about making sure that you build a suite of tools that no matter what level that you're at, they always remain useful.
Seeing how all these airbrushes are made, what precision it requires, and the philosophy that is behind all of the design decisions made for these airbrushes has really made us even more comfortable in recommending these airbrushes, and even more so in releasing yet another Squidmar airbrush with Harder and STEENBECK. And you guys have been begging us to re-release the airbrush we made 2 years ago. This one. But that was a limited edition airbrush and we're not gonna remake that. We have, however, made 3 completely new airbrushes. One for beginners, one for high-end painters, and one for army painters. Starting with the beginner airbrush, the Squidmar Ultra. Perfect beginner airbrush specifically designed to give you as a beginner the same experience as a professional when doing your basic tasks. Priming the miniatures, zenithal highlighting, adding base coats and blending. And the airbrush have been completely redesigned, starting with the front of the airbrush. It's been so cleverly designed so it's nearly impossible to get a dry tip. Having the needle visible from all angles, yet keeping it safe so you won't accidentally break the tip as a beginner. The trigger's been redesigned so that for the first time ever, you cannot pull back the trigger without pulling it down first, stopping you from creating splatters and for getting paint in the front of the airbrush. A lever down here that you can adjust so that you will understand how far back you can pull the trigger depending on what you're painting at this moment. And that's just a couple of the updated design features to this Squidmar Ultra. All with the precision that you always get when you buy an Harder and STEENBECK airbrush, and it's just as easy to pull apart and clean. Of course, packed together with all of the amazing design features that a Squidmar airbrush should have. This one with the Squidmar design will only be available for 2 weeks, so if you want this neat looking airbrush, make sure to get it right now. Each one of these are made to order and will be numbered, so it's again a limited edition run of the Squidmar design. The classical silver design will of course be available after that, but then you don't have our neat design. We'll keep the link down there so you'll still be able to get this one, even probably years into the future. If you already are experienced, or if you are an army painter that's used an airbrush for a year already, the new Evolution and Infinity with the new Squidmar designs will be available within the coming 2 months, so stick around for that. But that's it for today. Thanks everyone for watching this video. Give it a like if you feel like you learned something or enjoyed this type of video. Subscribe if you want to see more hobby videos. And a massive thanks to all of our amazing patrons, especially the top donors. You guys are amazing. With that said, have a good day and buy the airbrush. It's amazing. Some poor bastard is now gonna officially get an airbrush that I had a hand in making.